Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, I wish to second the amendment made by the Honourable Phil Goff on behalf of one of your constituents, Mr Speaker, Mr Henry Lindsay of Southland, who is an 84-year-old whose family have emailed up. He unfortunately has kidney cancer and heart failure, and he received a couple of hours a week of home help. That is until that government cut it out. And we received a second email from his son telling us that unfortunately he'd been admitted to hospital suffering from exhaustion, and he is still there. And if the Minister of Finance cares to tote it up, the $700 a day he is now costing the taxpayer would have covered his home help probably for the rest of his natural life. But Henry Lindsay of Southland is just a taste of people who will suffer in the future because of this government. Scene 2, Mr Speaker, I was in a Noel Leeming's store in Newmarket last weekend, first weekend after the budget. Signs up everywhere. Beat the GST rise. Buy your flat screen TV today. And if this government thinks that New Zealanders are going to suddenly save and enhance the national wealth because of the baubles and beads in this budget, then they've got another thing coming, because there'll be a roaring trade in flat-screen TVs all over Newmarket, while the Mr Lindsays of this world are struggling to get the care they need. And when the budget hype lifts and the hangover sets in, Mr Speaker, ordinary Kiwis will know the truth, that they've been sold a pup, that this is not a step-change budget. This is not a step-forward budget, not even a small step budget. It's not a step up, it's a set-up. It is a set-up because it is the sucker punch of the real blow yet to come. It is not an economic budget, it is a political budget. A budget designed to try and do one thing, to get the National Party elected next year so that the real privatisation, and Bill English said what he thought on Friday last, the real privatisations and the real cuts are to come in the second term. Let's hope that New Zealanders join together and stop that from happening. Today, sir, I want to ask three quick questions. For the ordinary Kiwi, what does the budget mean for you? What does the budget mean for the country? And what does the budget mean for the future? What does the budget mean to you? National has made it tougher for Kiwis to get ahead, to deliver better jobs and higher incomes. They have dashed the hopes of ordinary New Zealanders at the checkout counter. Mr Speaker, early in my time as an MP, I was door knocking in a place in New Lynn called Northall Road, and I met a young mum who was on the DPB. She had 3 young boys about the age of my own kids, and she had just come back from the doctor. The youngest one was calcium deficient, and as I talked to her, she cried because she could not afford milk to feed her boys. She could afford milk powder, sir, but not milk, so she cried. And she did better under Labour in the 9 years that followed. She was able to use the training incentive allowance to get a job when the kids were old enough. And she's probably lost that job now in the wave of unemployment that has grown since the change of government, sir. And one thing is for sure, she is not going to be better off from this budget. And I'll tell you why. Mr Speaker, my colleague will hold up the bar graph. This is gross income for an average wage earner on budget numbers. On budget numbers, when you put in the budget documents inflation rate, the average wage earner after their tax cut is not going to break even till 2 elections' time, 2014. And if my colleague holds up the second graph, he will show what happens to minimum wage earners. They just break even after tax by 2014, but the average wage earner doesn't even do that. That is why, Mr Speaker, 75 to 80% of Māori and over 80% of Pacifica are going to be worse off after this budget. Ordinary New Zealanders will be worse off after this budget. Henry Lindsay of Southland will be worse off after this budget. But let's not put it in terms of fancy graphs and statistics. Let's talk about who else is going to be worse off. Anybody with a child who has been benefiting from 20 hours free early childhood education is at risk of paying up to $31 a week for that child to be in childcare. The learning, outstanding, he says, the learning of our youngest New Zealanders impeded, but only if your parents can't afford to pay. That's Paul Quinn said that. The Hansard will show that Paul Quinn said outstanding when ordinary families are paying $31 a week for their early childhood education. Or the tenants in the Rata Street flats in Newland, Housing Corp flats, where some genius forgot to put an extractor fan in the bathroom, so they are covered in mould and rot and rising damp all winter, and they desperately needed part of the money that was there for improvements and refurbishments in the state housing estate, the 100-odd million that has been slashed out of this budget. Those New Zealanders will not be better off. Those state housing tenants will have to live with the asthma and the respiratory disease from that rising damp. Mr. Speaker, if the budget is not good for ordinary Kiwis, is it at least justified by some overwhelming result for the nation as a whole? And the answer, sir, is sadly no. By the Minister's own admission, there will be no reduction in the widening gap between rich and poor. How could it be, sir? A millionaire person earning $1 million a year gets $1,000 a week tax back. 15% of the total tax refund goes to the top 1% of earners. 1/3 goes to the top 5%. I say shame. Those aren't the people who've had to tough it out through the recession. Those aren't the people who've done it tough, trying to make the grocery bill meet at the checkout counter. Those people will be disappointed when it still doesn't meet every year from now to 2014. Mr. Speaker, is there a great growth impact to make up for that social inequity? The answer is no. On the budget's own figures, it takes over 7 years to scrape up an extra 1% of growth. Over 7 years to accumulate 1%, not even 1% of extra growth. And this was a government that promised step change to catch up with Australia, 2% a year they needed. What have they got? Less than 1/7 of 1% each year over the next decade. Pathetic. Pathetic, but of course they were pulling the wrong levers. Nobody on this side would have put their faith in trickle-down. Supply-side economics was dead and buried after Ronald Reagan. On employment, sir, Mr. Speaker, this is important. Less than 10,000 jobs forecast, while unemployment widens by 60,000, and they create less than half the jobs that Labor created in its term of office. But this budget is delivering only 3% of the total growth in employment. The rest would have happened anyway. 3%, that's the best that they could do. The external account more than doubles from 3% of GDP to 7% of GDP because of this budget. We are not paying our way in the world. We are not exporting enough. We are not saving enough. We are not innovating enough. And this was the government's big chance to turn the boat around, and they failed, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, total national debt approaches 100% for the first time in our history. And to be fair to Bill English, he had the courage to say that was our biggest single vulnerability. And I agree with Bill English on that. But what did he do in response? He made it worse by borrowing an extra $1.1 billion to give $1,000 a week to someone earning $1 million a year. Ridiculous. He called it the biggest single vulnerability, and he broke his promise to be revenue neutral on his tax package, making that promise worse. This budget is not good for ordinary New Zealanders. It is not good for the country. So the big question, sir, is why do it? Here's the rub. This is the sucker punch, New Zealand. This is the hoodwink to make you think you are better off, so you vote for this lot one more time, and then, Mr English, let the cat out of the bag. Kiwi Bank is the first of many